Timber Ridge, Wyoming Territory, spring 1883. The auction block stood in the center of the town square, a weathered wooden platform that had seen its share of cattle sales, equipment trades, and the occasional exchange of horses. Today, it would witness something different, something that made the spring breeze turn cold despite the warming afternoon sun. Abigail Harper stood with her head bowed, chestnut hair falling forward to shield her face from the crowd gathering before the platform. Her hands, once soft from a privileged life, now bore the small calluses of recent hardship. She wore her last good dress, navy blue with modest lace at the collar, though it hung a bit loose after months of diminished meals. "Step up, Miss Harper. Let the good folks see what they're bidding on." Her father's voice, once commanding in the drawing rooms of Philadelphia society, now carried a desperate edge. Walter Harper, former merchant, failed investor, and now a man drowning in debt, placed a hand on his daughter's back, urging her forward. Abigail's legs felt leaden as she climbed the 3 wooden steps. The sound of her boots against the rough planks seemed to echo across the square, drowning out even the distant laughter from the spring fair beyond. She raised her eyes briefly, taking in the curious faces staring back at her. Some held pity, others something darker, more appraising. Sheriff Thomas Riley stood at the edge of the gathering, his weathered face tight with disapproval, but he made no move to intervene. What was happening might turn the stomach, but it wasn't illegal, not in a territory where the law had gaps wide enough to drive a wagon through. "Folks of Timber Ridge," Walter Harper announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet square, "I find myself in unfortunate circumstances, owing to investments gone sour." He straightened his vest, a ghost of his former dignified manner. "I offer my daughter's services to settle my debts. She's 25, educated at Miss Porter's School for Young Ladies, skilled in figures and letters. She can keep books, manage a household, and work without complaint." He paused, then added the words that made Abigail close her eyes in shame. "She cannot bear children as determined by physicians after 5 years of marriage, but she'll serve loyally in whatever capacity you require." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Women pulled children closer. Men exchanged glances. Abigail kept her gaze fixed on a distant point beyond the gathered townsfolk, refusing to acknowledge the whispers, the barely concealed laughter. "That Montgomery fellow sure knew what he was doing, sending her back," one man muttered, loud enough to be heard. "What kind of father sells his own flesh and blood?" a woman whispered to her companion. Abigail stood perfectly still, a statue carved from shame and silent dignity. This moment, this public humiliation, was the culmination of a descent that had begun 5 years earlier when Edward Montgomery, her husband of 5 years, had publicly announced their marriage dissolved on grounds of her failure to produce an heir. His new wife, barely 19, was already expecting their first child. Then came her father's financial collapse, the creditors at their door, and finally this, being offered to the highest bidder like a piece of livestock. "We'll start the bidding at $20, Walter announced, his voice faltering slightly. "A fair price for an educated woman who'll work hard." Silence fell over the square. Abigail's cheeks burned. Not even worth $20 then. "$10, called a voice from the back, followed by coarse laughter. "For damaged goods." "15, countered another, a heavy-set man who owned the saloon at the edge of town. "She's easy on the eyes, at least." The bidding continued, each offer punctuated by comments that made Abigail's stomach twist. She fixed her gaze on a lone hawk circling in the blue sky above, envying its freedom. $50. The deep voice cut through the chatter, silencing the crowd. Heads turned toward a tall figure at the edge of the gathering. Samuel Donovan stood with one shoulder leaning against a hitching post, his posture deceptively casual. But there was nothing relaxed in his eyes, dark, intense, and fixed on the auctioneer rather than Abigail. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to hardship. His clothes were practical but well-maintained, dark trousers, a blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and a black vest. A rancher's attire, though rumors persisted there was more to his past than cattle and horses. Whispers immediately swept through the crowd. Samuel Donovan rarely came to town, and when he did, he spoke little and left quickly. His ranch sat isolated in the foothills beyond Timber Ridge, and most folks knew him only by reputation. Some said he'd been a doctor back east before something drove him west. Others claimed he had lost a wife and child and never recovered from the grief. Walter Harper's eyes widened at the sum. $50 from Mr. Donovan, he announced, hope creeping into his voice. Do I hear 60? A moment of silence followed, then another man stepped forward with a smirk. $51. Seems the good doctor wants company. Let's see how much he's willing to pay for it. Several others joined in, the bidding climbing not out of genuine interest, but from a cruel desire to see how far they could push the mysterious rancher. Abigail felt her humiliation deepen with each call, each laugh. At $75, Samuel Donovan pushed away from the hitching post. With deliberate steps, he approached the auction block, his walking stick striking the ground with purpose. The crowd parted before him, conversations fading to silence. He stopped directly in front of the platform, looking up at Walter Harper rather than Abigail. Without a word, he pulled a leather pouch from his vest pocket and tossed it onto the wooden planks. The distinct clink of gold coins sounded as it landed. $100, he said, his voice low but carrying across the now silent square. And we end this spectacle now. Walter reached for the pouch with barely disguised eagerness, but Samuel's walking stick came down firmly on the man's wrist. Count it first, Samuel instructed coldly, so there can be no question later. Red-faced, Walter did as instructed, confirming the sum before nodding. Samuel's gaze swept over the gathered townsfolk, his expression hardening. That's enough, he said, voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced even the most boisterous onlookers. She's a human being, not livestock. The transaction is complete. He extended a hand toward Abigail, not looking directly at her. Miss Harper. It wasn't a request so much as a statement. Abigail hesitated only briefly before placing her trembling hand in his. His palm was warm, calloused from work, and his grip firm as he helped her down from the platform. The crowd began to disperse, some looking ashamed now that the entertainment had concluded, others still whispering behind raised hands. Samuel kept Abigail's hand in his until they reached a wagon hitched at the edge of the square. Only then did he release her, gesturing for her to climb up to the bench seat. As she settled onto the wooden seat, Abigail finally found her voice. Mr. Donovan, Not here, he interrupted quietly, glancing back toward the lingering onlookers. Town has too many ears. He climbed up beside her and took the reins, clicking his tongue to set the horses in motion. They left Timber Ridge in silence, the wagon wheels creaking beneath them. They traveled for nearly an hour before either spoke again. The town had disappeared behind them, replaced by rolling grasslands that stretched toward distant foothills. The spring sun warmed Abigail's shoulders, a strange contrast to the cold uncertainty in her chest. I can't repay you, she finally said, her voice barely audible above the rhythm of hooves and wheels. Not in money, at least. Samuel kept his eyes on the trail ahead. I didn't expect repayment. Then why? The question escaped before she could consider whether it was wise to ask. He was silent for so long that Abigail thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice had softened slightly. I can't buy a human soul, Miss Harper. No one can. I merely paid to ensure they left you alone. The simple dignity in those words brought unexpected tears to Abigail's eyes. She blinked them away, unwilling to show weakness now. What will be expected of me, she asked, straightening her shoulders. Cooking, cleaning, managing the household accounts. He glanced at her briefly. Your father mentioned you were educated. That will be useful. And other duties? The question was painful but necessary. Samuel's hands tightened on the reins before deliberately relaxing. No, he said firmly. You'll have your own room with a lock on the door. I'm not looking for a wife or a companion of that nature. Relief washed through her, though it was quickly tempered by practicality. If I wish to leave? The stagecoach passes 10 miles south every Thursday. I won't hold anyone against their will. He guided the horses around a bend in the trail. But I'd ask you to give the arrangement a month before deciding. The journey to anywhere from here requires funds, which I'll provide if you still wish to leave then. They crested a small rise, and the trail opened onto a view that made Abigail catch her breath. A verdant valley spread before them, bisected by a winding creek that glinted silver in the afternoon sun. Wild lupines painted patches of purple across the green expanse. swaying gently in the breeze. Samuel drew the wagon to a halt, allowing the horses to rest and Abigail to take in the sight. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "My mother called it Meadow Creek," he replied, a hint of something warmer in his voice, though the maps name it differently. He climbed down from the wagon without warning, walking a few paces into the meadow. Abigail watched as he stooped to pick something, then returned to the wagon. In his weathered hand lay a single wild lupine, its purple blossoms vibrant against his palm. "My mother used to say that the things people dismiss often hold the most beauty." He held the flower out to her. "You're free to leave whenever you choose, Miss Harper, but if you stay, I promise you won't be treated as they did back there." Abigail accepted the flower, its delicate petals a startling contrast to the calloused fingers that had offered it. For the first time since the auction block, she met Samuel Donovan's gaze directly. His eyes were deep brown, carrying a weight of experience that made them seem older than his years. But there was something else there too, a steadiness, a quiet integrity that hadn't been present in any of the men who had bid on her in town. "Thank you, Mr. Donovan." He nodded once, then returned to his position on the wagon bench. As they continued their journey, Abigail cradled the lupine in her lap, its vibrant color a single point of beauty in a day filled with ugliness. Donovan Ranch sprawled across the foothills like a kingdom fallen into neglect. The main house, built of sturdy logs with a stone foundation, stood 2 stories tall, its windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. A large barn, a bunkhouse, and several smaller outbuildings completed the central compound, while split-rail fences marked pastures that extended toward distant cottonwood trees lining the creek. Signs of former prosperity were evident in the quality of the structures, but equally apparent was the lack of recent maintenance. Paint peeled from window frames, one corner of the porch sagged slightly, and what had once been a kitchen garden was now mostly weeds, with a few hardy herbs fighting for survival. Yet the place had good bones, Abigail thought, as the wagon rolled to a stop before the main house. With care and attention, it could be restored. "Home," Samuel said simply, setting the brake and climbing down. He came around to offer Abigail assistance, which she accepted with quiet dignity. As her feet touched the ground, the front door of the house opened. A woman appeared on the porch, older with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a simple bun. She leaned heavily on a cane, her right side seeming stiffer than her left. "Miss Harper, this is my mother, Martha Donovan," Samuel said, guiding Abigail toward the porch. "Mother, this is Abigail Harper. She'll be staying with us, helping with the house and accounts." Martha Donovan's eyes, the same deep brown as her son's, studied Abigail with an intensity that suggested her physical limitations hadn't dulled her mind. She nodded once but made no attempt to speak. Instead, she gestured toward the door with her good hand. "Mother suffered an apoplexy 2 years ago," Samuel explained quietly as they followed Martha inside. "Her right side is weakened, and she cannot speak, but she understands everything." The interior of the house was much like the exterior, signs of quality and care from years past, now faded through neglect. The furnishings were solid and well-crafted but needed polishing. Dust had settled on bookshelves and cobwebs adorned corners where ceiling met wall. Martha led them to a sitting room where a fire burned low in the hearth. She lowered herself carefully into a rocking chair, then fixed her gaze on Abigail, as if waiting for her to speak. "I'm pleased to meet you, Mrs. Donovan," Abigail said, summoning the manners that had been drilled into her since childhood. "Your home has a wonderful setting. The view coming in was breathtaking." Martha's expression remained unchanged, neither welcoming nor openly hostile. She simply watched, assessing. Samuel cleared his throat. "I'll show you to your room. You must be tired after everything." He led Abigail up a creaking staircase to the second floor, where a hallway extended in both directions. "My room is at the far end," he said, gesturing to the right. "Mother's is downstairs, off the kitchen, since the stairs became difficult for her. This will be yours." He opened a door midway down the left hallway. The room beyond was simply furnished but clean, cleaner than in the rest of the house, Abigail noticed. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt stood against one wall, a small dresser opposite. A window looked out over the creek and distant hills. "There's a lock," Samuel said, pointing to a simple bolt on the inside of the door. "As I promised." Abigail stepped into the room, feeling the strange weight of ownership after hours of having none. "Thank you." Samuel lingered in the doorway, seeming uncertain for the first time since she'd met him. Supper is at 6. The kitchen is functional, if not organized. Feel free to change things as needed. He paused. Do you need anything else now? Abigail glanced around the room that would be her sanctuary in this strange new life. No, thank you. This is more than I expected. He nodded and turned to leave, then stopped. Miss Harper, what happened in town today? It doesn't define who you are. Before she could respond, he was gone, footsteps retreating down the hallway. Abigail closed the door slowly, sliding the bolt into place with a soft click that sounded like safety. She sank onto the edge of the bed, finally allowing the events of the day to wash over her. Tears came then, silent, dignified tears that left trails down her cheeks. She didn't cry for the humiliation of the auction block, nor for the father who had sold her to cover his debts. She cried for the young woman she had been 5 years ago, stepping into marriage with dreams of love and family, unaware that her worth would be measured only by her ability to produce an heir. When the tears subsided, Abigail rose and moved to the window. The view beyond the glass was nothing like the brick walls and narrow streets of Philadelphia. Here, space stretched endlessly, the land rolling toward mountains that stood like sentinels on the horizon. Freedom and imprisonment, all at once. She placed the lupin flower Samuel had given her on the windowsill, its purple petals vivid against the weathered wood. Its meaning wasn't lost on her. A wild thing considered by many to be a weed, yet beautiful in its resilience. By the time the grandfather clock downstairs chimed 6, Abigail had washed her face, pinned her hair back neatly, and changed into the simplest of the 3 dresses she'd been allowed to bring. She descended the stairs with measured steps, determined to face her new reality with the same dignity that had carried her through the auction. The kitchen was indeed functional but disorganized. Pots hung haphazardly from hooks, dishes were stacked without system, and the pantry contained an odd assortment of staples. Someone had made an attempt at supper. A pot of something that might have been stew simmered on the stove, and a loaf of bread sat on the cutting board, clearly purchased rather than homemade. Martha sat at the kitchen table, a slate board and chalk beside her plate. Samuel stood at the stove, stirring the pot with the awkward motions of a man unaccustomed to cooking. May I? Abigail asked, approaching the stove. Samuel relinquished the spoon with evident relief. Please. A quick taste confirmed her suspicions. The stew was bland, underseasoned, and slightly overcooked. Still, it was food, and she had known hunger enough in recent months to appreciate even this. She found salt and dried herbs in a cupboard, adding them to the pot with a practiced hand. After a few minutes of stirring, she served the improved stew into bowls, placing them on the table with the bread and butter she'd located. The meal passed in near silence. Samuel ate methodically, his attention seemingly turned inward. Martha watched Abigail throughout the meal, her gaze unreadable. Only once did she reach for the slate board, writing slowly with her left hand. Where from? Philadelphia originally, Abigail answered, though I've been in Denver these past 2 years since my husband. She paused, then continued with deliberate steadiness. Since my marriage ended. Martha's eyes narrowed slightly, but she wrote nothing more. After the meal, Abigail rose to clear the dishes. I'll tidy up, she said, and perhaps tomorrow I could take inventory of the pantry, see what might be needed from town. That would be helpful, Samuel replied. Kitchen matters were never my area of expertise. What is? The question slipped out before Abigail could consider its propriety. A shadow crossed Samuel's face. Ranching now, he said, rising from the table. I'll be in the barn if you need anything. Mother usually retires early. He left without further explanation, the back door closing softly behind him. Martha remained at the table, watching as Abigail washed the dishes and wiped down the worktops. When Abigail had finished, the older woman tapped her cane against the floor to gain attention. She wrote laboriously on her slate, Why did he bring you? The directness of the question caught Abigail off guard. I'm not entirely sure, she admitted. Your son doesn't explain himself much. Martha's eyes held a hint of something, perhaps amusement, perhaps skepticism. She wiped the slate clean and wrote again, Be careful. I don't intend to cause any trouble, Mrs. Donovan. The older woman shook her head, frustration evident in the tightness around her eyes. She wrote again, more slowly, with his heart. Before Abigail could respond to this unexpected warning, Martha pushed herself upright with her cane and made her way out of the kitchen, her right leg dragging slightly as she disappeared down the hallway that presumably led to her room. Left alone in the quiet kitchen, Abigail finished her work methodically, organizing as she cleaned. The warning, if that's what it had been, lingered in her mind, as if Samuel Donovan's heart were something she might damage, when she herself felt like little more than a piece of property that had changed hands. Later, as she prepared for bed in her small room, Abigail noticed something she had missed earlier. Tucked beneath the edge of the bed was a heated brick wrapped in flannel, still radiating gentle warmth into the cool night air. Someone, Samuel most likely, had thought to provide this small comfort. It was a thoughtful gesture, one that seemed at odds with his reserved demeanor. As Abigail slid between the sheets, the brick warming her feet, she reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. From society wife to cast-off burden to whatever this arrangement was. The last thing she saw before closing her eyes was the lupine flower on the windowsill, silhouetted against the moonlit sky, a small reminder that value existed beyond what others could see. Outside her window, the Wyoming night deepened, stars emerging like silver pinpricks in a velvet canopy. In the barn, Samuel Donovan sat alone with a ledger open before him, quill poised over figures that refused to balance. And in her room off the kitchen, Martha Donovan stared at the ceiling, memories and regrets her only companions in the darkness. Three souls under one roof, each carrying their private burdens, none knowing how their lives would intertwine in the days to come. Days at Donovan Ranch settled into a rhythm. Abigail rose early, preparing breakfast before Samuel went out to work with the small crew of ranch hands who maintained the property. She spent mornings cleaning and organizing the house room by room, afternoons tending to accounts or mending, and evenings preparing supper. Martha watched her constantly, those dark eyes missing nothing. The older woman rarely communicated beyond essential questions on her slate board, but Abigail often felt her presence, observing from doorways, following her movements with an intensity that bordered on suspicion. Samuel remained an enigma. He spoke when necessary, always polite but reserved. He left the house before dawn and often returned after dark, taking his meals quickly before retreating to the study or barn. Only occasionally did Abigail glimpse something beyond his carefully maintained facade. A moment of gentleness when he helped his mother from a chair. A flash of unexpected knowledge when he commented on a book Abigail was reading. The ranch itself revealed its secrets slowly. The bunkhouse housed only 3 men, far fewer than a property this size would normally employ. The fields showed signs of reduced cultivation, and the herd sizes were modest compared to the capacity of the land. It was as if everything, the house, the ranch, and its owner, existed in a state of deliberate contraction, pulling inward rather than expanding outward as successful enterprises typically did. 2 weeks after her arrival, Abigail discovered the library. She had assumed the closed door at the end of the main hallway led to a storage room, as Samuel never entered it and Martha showed no interest in it. Curiosity finally compelled her to open it while dusting that section of the house. The room beyond the door took her breath away. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with volumes whose leather spines spoke of quality and care. A large desk stood before the 4th wall, positioned to catch light from tall windows that overlooked the distant mountains. A comfortable reading chair with a side table occupied one corner, and a rolling ladder provided access to the highest shelves. Unlike the rest of the house, the library showed no signs of neglect. The furniture gleamed with polish, the floor was swept clean, and not a speck of dust marred the book spines. Someone, Samuel presumably, maintained this room with meticulous care. Abigail stepped inside, drawn by the familiar comfort of books. Her fingers trailed along the shelves, recognizing classics of literature alongside volumes of poetry, history, and natural philosophy. But the collection that dominated the room was medical texts, rows upon rows of them, many bearing the insignia of Boston Medical College. "You shouldn't be in here." Abigail startled, turning to find Samuel in the doorway. His expression was carefully neutral, but tension radiated from his rigid posture. "I apologize," she said, stepping away from the shelves. "I was cleaning and thought, I maintain this room myself." The interruption was gentle but firm. "It doesn't require your attention." Abigail nodded, moving toward the door. As she passed him, she couldn't resist asking, Were you a doctor, Mr. Donovan? Something flickered in his eyes, pain or perhaps anger, quickly suppressed. In another life, he said, his voice low. One eye left behind. He stepped aside to let her pass, then closed the door firmly behind them both. That evening, as Abigail sat in her room mending one of Samuel's shirts, she reflected on the library and what it revealed. The medical texts, the Boston connection, his reference to another life, pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet assemble. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She set aside the mending and opened it to find Martha standing in the hallway, slateboard in hand. The older woman held it up for Abigail to read. He reads to me every night. Abigail wasn't sure how to respond to this unexpected confidence. That's very kind of him. Martha shook her head impatiently, erasing the slate with her sleeve and writing again. My eyes tire. Would you? The request surprised Abigail. Martha had shown little warmth toward her in the 2 weeks since her arrival. Of course, if you'd like me to. Martha nodded once, then turned and made her slow way back downstairs. Abigail followed, unsure what this invitation might mean. In the sitting room, Martha settled into her usual chair beside the hearth. She pointed to a book on the side table, a well-worn copy of Wuthering Heights. This is what Samuel reads to you, Abigail asked, picking up the volume. Martha nodded, then held up her slate. His voice good, but no patience for story. A smile tugged at Abigail's lips. Men often don't appreciate Bronte as they should. For the first time since her arrival, she saw Martha's expression soften, the hint of an answering smile in her eyes. Abigail sat in the chair opposite and opened the book to the marked page. She began to read, her voice gaining confidence as she settled into the familiar rhythm of the prose. Martha closed her eyes, listening. They had been reading for perhaps half an hour when the front door opened and Samuel entered. He paused in the doorway, surprise evident in his expression as he took in the scene. Mother asked if I would read to her, Abigail explained, closing the book with a finger marking her place. Samuel looked between them, something unreadable crossing his features. Thank you, he said finally. Her eyes trouble her in the evenings. Martha made a dismissive gesture, then wrote on her slate, Continue tomorrow. It was both a statement and a dismissal. Abigail nodded, placing a ribbon to mark their spot before returning the book to the side table. Good night, Mrs. Donovan, Mr. Donovan. She nodded to each of them before heading back upstairs, aware of Samuel's gaze following her retreat. That night began a new pattern. Each evening after supper, Abigail would read to Martha for an hour or so. Sometimes Samuel joined them, sitting quietly in a corner chair, his attention seemingly divided between the story and the women sharing it. Other times he would be absent, working in the barn or study. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere in the house began to shift. Martha's watchfulness lost some of its suspicion, and Samuel occasionally lingered at meals, offering brief insights into the day's work or asking Abigail's opinion on household matters. Small changes accumulated like dust, unremarkable individually but transformative in their totality. Abigail found herself thinking less often of leaving, her thoughts instead turning to improvements she might make to the house, the garden, the daily routine of the ranch. The first month passed, then 6 weeks. The promised stagecoach funds remained unmentioned by either Abigail or Samuel. Life at Donovan Ranch continued its measured pace, the present slowly eclipsing the past for all three inhabitants. Until the day Abigail found the box of unsent letters. She had been organizing the small desk in the sitting room, with Martha's permission, granted via a curt nod, when she discovered a false bottom in one of the drawers. Curiosity piqued, she carefully removed the hidden panel. Beneath lay a polished wooden box, its lid inlaid with mother-of-pearl in an intricate pattern. Abigail hesitated, aware she was crossing a boundary into privacy. But something, intuition perhaps, or the growing sense that Donovan Ranch held secrets that affected her own position there, compelled her to open it. Inside were letters, at least a dozen, each addressed in a strong masculine hand to Boston Medical College. Attention Dean Harrison. All were sealed, never sent. All bore Samuel Donovan's name in the corner, with dates spanning the past 3 years. Abigail closed the box quickly, replacing it and the false panel. She had not read the letters. That would be an unforgivable violation. But their existence raised questions she couldn't ignore. Why would Samuel write repeatedly to a medical college, only to keep the letters unsent? What connection did he maintain to a world he claimed to have left behind? And most pressing of all, what event had transformed a Boston physician into a reclusive Wyoming rancher? The answers, Abigail suspected, might determine not only Samuel's future, but her own. The discovery of the unsent letters lingered in Abigail's mind like an unresolved chord. Over the following days, she found her gaze drawn to Samuel with new curiosity, noting details that had previously escaped her attention. The precise way he splinted a ranch hand's injured finger, his careful measurement of Martha's medicinal powders, the medical journals she occasionally glimpsed on his desk, pages marked with notations. One afternoon, while Samuel was riding the northern boundary with the hands and Martha napped in her room, Abigail ventured into the library again. This time her purpose was deliberate rather than curious. She moved methodically along the shelves, examining the medical texts with careful attention. Many bore book plates identifying them as the property of Dr. S. Donovan, Boston Medical College. Others contained margin notes in a precise hand that matched the address on the unsent letters. The most heavily annotated volumes focused on obstetrics and surgical procedures, specialized knowledge that seemed at odds with the life of a cattle rancher. On a lower shelf, partially hidden behind larger volumes, Abigail discovered a slim leather journal. Unlike the academic texts surrounding it, this book bore no title on its spine. She hesitated, then carefully removed it, aware that she was crossing yet another boundary of privacy. The journal opened to reveal pages filled with diagrams, detailed sketches of surgical tools, anatomical drawings, and what appeared to be a modified forceps design. Notes in Samuel's handwriting surrounded each illustration, describing potential improvements to existing techniques for complicated childbirth. The final entry, dated 5 years earlier, contained a single sentence. The procedure failed. I have failed them both. Abigail closed the journal with trembling fingers, replacing it exactly as she had found it. The pieces were beginning to align. Samuel's medical background, his reluctance to discuss his past, the profound sorrow that sometimes shadowed his expression when he thought no one was watching. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Abigail turned swiftly to find Martha standing in the doorway, leaning heavily on her cane. The older woman's expression was unreadable, but her eyes, so like her son's, held a mixture of wariness and resignation. "Mrs. Donovan," Abigail said, guilt coloring her voice. "I was just—" Martha raised her hand, stopping the explanation. She moved slowly into the library, her gaze sweeping over the shelves before settling on Abigail. With deliberate movements, she lowered herself into the reading chair and placed her slate board on her lap. "You want to know," she wrote, the chalk scratching against the slate. It wasn't a question, but Abigail answered anyway. "Yes, I think I need to understand if I'm to stay here." Martha studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. She wiped the slate clean and began writing again, her left hand moving laboriously across the surface. "My son was a doctor, a good one, saved many lives." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts before continuing. "Could not save his wife and child." The simple statement confirmed Abigail's suspicions, yet hearing it, seeing it written in Martha's uneven hand, made her heart ache. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Martha's expression tightened, a flash of old pain crossing her features. She erased the slate with a sharp movement and wrote again. Emily was with child. Complications. Samuel tried new method to save both. Another pause, longer this time. Martha's hand trembled slightly as she completed the thought. Failed. Both died. He never forgave himself. Abigail sat carefully on the edge of the desk, absorbing the weight of Martha's words. "So he left medicine. Came here." Martha nodded, then added, "His father's ranch." "Samuel grew up here summers." The pieces continued to fall into place. "And you came to care for him after it happened?" A shadow passed over Martha's face. She wrote slowly, deliberately. "I came before, warned Emily of danger. She wouldn't listen." The implication of those words sent a chill through Abigail. "You knew there would be complications?" Martha's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She nodded once, then wrote with fierce determination. "My fault too. Should have told him sooner." Before Abigail could respond, a sound at the doorway drew her attention. Samuel stood there, his expression a mask of controlled emotion as he took in the scene. His mother and Abigail in the library he kept as his private sanctuary, the slate board between them revealing conversations never meant to be shared. "Mother," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "you should be resting." Martha shook her head stubbornly, writing again on her slate. "She deserves truth if staying." Samuel's jaw tightened. "That's not your decision to make." An unspoken current passed between mother and son, decades of understanding and conflict distilled into a single charged moment. Finally, Martha sighed and pushed herself to her feet, gathering her dignity despite her physical limitations. "Think about it," she wrote before shuffling past her son and out of the library. Samuel remained in the doorway, his gaze now fixed on Abigail. The silence stretched between them, taut with unspoken questions. "I apologize for intruding," Abigail said finally, rising from her perch on the desk edge. "It was wrong of me to come in here without permission." "Yes, it was." His voice was quiet but firm. "What exactly were you looking for, Miss Harper?" The direct question deserved a direct answer. "Understanding," she replied honestly. "About you, about this place, about why a skilled physician would abandon his profession to run a struggling ranch in Wyoming territory." Something flickered in Samuel's eyes. Surprise at her forthright response, perhaps, or respect for her candor. "And did you find your answers?" he asked, moving into the room to stand by the window, putting space between them. "Some," Abigail admitted. "Your mother told me about your wife and child, about the complications." She hesitated, then added gently, "I'm truly sorry for your loss, Mr. Donovan." Samuel turned toward the window, his profile silhouetted against the afternoon light. For a moment, Abigail thought he might dismiss her, retreat once more behind the wall of privacy he maintained so carefully. Instead, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "Emily was 26, brilliant, educated, the daughter of my medical professor." A brief, sad smile touched his lips before fading. "She understood my work better than anyone, supported my research when others called it radical." He ran a hand along the edge of a bookshelf, fingers tracing the spines of volumes that represented his former life. "When she became pregnant, we were elated. But by the 6th month, there were signs that troubled me. Her blood pressure, swelling, symptoms that suggested potential complications." Samuel turned back to face Abigail, his expression grave. "I had been developing a new surgical approach for such cases, a modified cesarean procedure that might save both mother and child when traditional methods would sacrifice one for the other." The clinical language couldn't disguise the personal anguish beneath his words. Her father, Dr. Frederick Montgomery, a respected surgeon in his own right, disagreed with my assessment. He insisted Emily's symptoms were normal, that my concerns were those of an anxious husband rather than a rational physician. Samuel moved to the desk, his fingers resting on the surface where the journal remained hidden. "When her labor began 2 months early, with severe complications, I prepared to perform the procedure. I knew it was her only chance in the babies." His voice grew quieter, weighted with memory. Frederick intervened. As her father and my senior colleague, he assumed authority in the delivery room. He chose conventional methods, prioritizing Emily's life over the child's. Samuel's hands clenched into fists on the desktop. "He failed. I failed. We lost them both, Emily and our son, and in the aftermath, Frederick ensured I was held responsible. He called my research reckless, my judgment compromised by personal attachment. My medical license was suspended pending review." Abigail remained still, hardly daring to breathe as Samuel revealed the tragedy that had shaped his existence. "I couldn't stay in Boston," he continued. "Every street, every building held memories of Emily, and the medical community that had once respected me now viewed me with suspicion or pity." His shoulders straightened slightly. "So I came here to the ranch my father had left me, a place where no one knew Dr. Samuel Donovan, where I could simply exist without the weight of my failure following me." "It wasn't failure," Abigail said softly. "You weren't even permitted to try your procedure." Samuel's gaze snapped to hers, surprise evident in his expression. "That distinction matters little to a grieving husband." "Perhaps not then," she acknowledged, "but it should matter now after years of carrying blame that isn't fully yours." A heavy silence fell between them. Samuel studied her with an intensity that might have made her uncomfortable weeks earlier, but now felt like genuine seeing rather than mere observation. "You speak with remarkable directness, Miss Harper," he said finally. "Circumstances have stripped away my taste for polite fictions," she replied. "I spent 5 years in a marriage where truths were hidden beneath pleasantries, only to discover too late what my husband really valued. I won't make that mistake again." Samuel nodded slowly. "Fair enough." He gestured toward the door. "I believe we've had enough revelations for one afternoon. Perhaps we could continue this conversation another time." It was a dismissal, albeit a gentle one. Abigail accepted it with grace, moving toward the door. At the threshold, she paused, looking back at him. "Thank you for telling me the truth, Mr. Donovan. I know it wasn't easy." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Few worthwhile things are, Miss Harper." As she closed the library door behind her, Abigail felt something shift between them. A barrier lowered, if not removed entirely. The painful truth Samuel had shared created a new foundation, one built on honesty rather than the transactional nature of their original arrangement. Whether that foundation would support whatever came next remained to be seen. The following morning dawned clear and crisp, autumn asserting itself in the golden light that slanted across the hills. Abigail rose early, as had become her habit, and descended to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. To her surprise, Martha was already there, attempting to manage a pot of coffee with her good hand. "Let me help," Abigail offered, moving to take over the task. Martha relinquished the pot with a nod of thanks, then gestured toward the slate board on the table. "Going to town today. Need supplies." "Of course," Abigail replied, measuring coffee grounds into the pot. "I can make a list. Is Samuel taking the wagon?" Martha shook her head. "You go. Both of us. Samuel busy with cattle." The prospect of visiting Timber Ridge again sent a flutter of anxiety through Abigail's stomach. She hadn't returned to town since the day of the auction, and the thought of facing those who had witnessed her humiliation made her palms dampen. Martha seemed to read her hesitation. She wrote again, her expression determined. Time to show face. Head high. The simple encouragement, coming from a woman who had initially regarded her with suspicion, warmed Abigail unexpectedly. "You're right," she agreed. "I can't avoid town forever." Samuel entered the kitchen then, already dressed for work in the fields. He raised an eyebrow at finding both women engaged in conversation. "Mother wants us to go to town for supplies," Abigail explained, pouring coffee into 3 cups. "If that's agreeable to you." Samuel glanced between them, clearly noting the shift in dynamics. "The north pasture fence needs mending before winter," he said. "I won't be able to take you." "We go alone," Martha wrote, showing him the slate. "Take small wagon." A frown creased Samuel's brow. "I'm not sure that's wise. The road can be rough. In your health." Martha's expression hardened with maternal authority that transcended her physical limitations. She wrote firmly, "Not invalid, need to go." Samuel sighed, recognizing the futility of arguing. "Very well, but be back before dark. And take the Winchester, just in case." He turned to Abigail. "You do know how to handle a rifle?" "My father taught me," she answered, surprised by the question. "Though it's been some years." He nodded. "It's likely you won't need it, but the territory can be unpredictable. I'll put it in the wagon before you leave." After breakfast, Samuel helped Martha into the smaller of the 2 wagons, while Abigail gathered their supply list and a bit of money from the household funds. The Winchester rifle lay wrapped in oilcloth beneath the seat, a precaution that Abigail hoped was unnecessary. "Be careful," Samuel said as he handed Abigail the reins. The concern in his voice seemed to extend beyond the routine caution of an employer. "We will," she promised, settling her bonnet more firmly against the autumn breeze. The journey to town took just under 2 hours, the wagon bumping along the rutted trail that connected Donovan Ranch to Timber Ridge. Martha sat beside Abigail in companionable silence, occasionally pointing out landmarks or wildlife with her good hand. As they crested the final rise before town, Abigail's hands tightened on the reins. Timber Ridge spread before them, unchanged from the day she'd last seen it. The same dusty main street, the same cluster of wooden buildings, the same church steeple rising above the mercantile. Martha placed a weathered hand over Abigail's, a gesture of surprising tenderness. When Abigail glanced at her, the older woman's eyes held understanding rather than pity. She nodded once, a silent affirmation of confidence, then returned her hand to her lap. Drawing a deep breath, Abigail straightened her shoulders and guided the wagon into town. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. As they made their way down the main street toward the general store, faces turned, conversations paused, and fingers pointed. Abigail kept her gaze forward, her expression carefully composed into what her mother had called her society face, pleasant but reserved, revealing nothing of her inner thoughts. She helped Martha down from the wagon with practiced care, then secured the horses before accompanying the older woman into the store. A bell jingled as they entered, announcing their presence to the half-dozen customers already inside. The storekeeper, a portly man with mutton chop whiskers, looked up from measuring fabric. His surprise at seeing Martha Donovan was evident, but it was his recognition of Abigail that caused a ripple of whispers among the other customers. "Mrs. Donovan," he greeted, nodding respectfully. "Been a while since you ventured to town?" Martha acknowledged him with a slight inclination of her head, then gestured toward Abigail. "Miss Harper and I have a list," Abigail said, stepping forward with practiced poise. "Would you be so kind as to help us gather these items?" The storekeeper accepted the list, his curious gaze lingering on Abigail a moment too long. "Of course, ma'am, most of these we have in stock. The medical powders might take a special order, though." "That's fine," Abigail replied evenly. "We can wait if necessary." While the storekeeper gathered their supplies, Abigail helped Martha to a chair near the window, conscious of the continued glances from other customers. Two women by the dry goods shelf whispered behind raised hands, their gazes darting between Abigail and Martha. Living out there together, just the three of them. Heard Donovan paid good money for her. What kind of arrangement? The fragments of conversation reached Abigail's ears, despite their lowered voices. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, but maintained her composure, busying herself with examining a display of autumn fabrics. Martha, however, was less inclined toward patience. She rapped her cane sharply on the wooden floor, drawing the attention of everyone in the store. When the whispering women looked her way, she fixed them with a stern glare that needed no words to convey its message. The women had the grace to look abashed, turning back to their shopping with reddened cheeks. Abigail bit back a smile at Martha's fierce defense. It was the first time the older woman had shown such direct support, and the gesture warmed her beyond measure. Their shopping concluded without further incident. As the storekeeper tallied their purchases, the bell above the door jingled again. Abigail glanced up, then felt her blood freeze in her veins. Edward Montgomery stood in the doorway as impeccably dressed as always in a tailored suit that spoke of Eastern wealth. Beside him, a young woman heavy with child clung to his arm, her eyes downcast beneath a fashionable bonnet. For a moment, no one moved. Edward's gaze locked with Abigail's across the store, surprise giving way to a calculated smile that never reached his eyes. "Well," he said, his cultured voice carrying in the suddenly silent store. "What an unexpected pleasure. Abigail, isn't it?" As if he could have forgotten. As if 5 years of marriage could be reduced to a casual acquaintance barely remembered. Abigail straightened her spine, summoning every ounce of dignity she possessed. "Mr. Montgomery," she acknowledged with a slight nod. "I trust you're well." Edward guided his pregnant wife further into the store, positioning himself so that the comparison between the two women would be unmistakable to onlookers. "Quite well, thank you. Business brings me through these rustic parts occasionally." His gaze swept over her simple dress, the practical boots visible beneath her hem. "I see you've adapted to frontier life." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. Beside Abigail, Martha shifted in her chair, tension radiating from her rigid posture. "I have," Abigail replied evenly. "The territory suits me." Edward's smile turned sharp. "Does it? How fortunate, then, that things worked out as they did." He gestured toward his wife, whose discomfort was evident in her flushed cheeks. "Caroline and I are expecting our first child next month. A son, the doctor believes." The deliberate cruelty of his words, highlighting precisely what he had discarded Abigail for, struck like a physical blow. But Abigail had endured worse humiliations than this. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her wounded. "Congratulations," she said coolly. "I wish you both well." Edward's expression faltered slightly at her composure. He had expected tears, perhaps, or stammered excuses. Not this calm dignity. Yes, well, he continued, his tone sharpening. I must say, when I heard what became of you after Denver, I was quite shocked. To think that Walter Harper would sell his own daughter like common merchandise. He glanced around the store, playing to his audience. Though I suppose damaged goods must be sold at discount. A collective intake of breath followed his words. Even those who had whispered about Abigail earlier seemed shocked by the direct cruelty of Edward's statement. Before Abigail could respond, Martha's cane struck the floor with a crack like gunshot. All eyes turned to the older woman as she pushed herself upright, her expression thunderous. She snatched her slate board from the counter, chalk moving furiously across its surface. She thrust the slate toward Edward, holding it steady with a strength that belied her physical limitations. My son did not buy this woman. He saved her from men like you. Edward blinked, taken aback by the fierce defense from an unexpected quarter. He recovered quickly, his smile turning patronizing. How touching. But facts remain facts, Mrs. Donovan. And the fact is, your son paid money for a woman who couldn't fulfill the most basic duty of her sex. Edward, please, his wife murmured, distress evident in her voice. Let's just complete our business and go. He ignored her, his attention fixed on Abigail with the particular cruelty of a man who knows exactly where to place the blade for maximum damage. Tell me, Abigail, does your new position include all wifely duties or merely the ones you're capable of performing? The storekeeper stepped forward, discomfort evident in his expression. Mr. Montgomery, I'll have to ask you to moderate your language. There are ladies present. Edward waved a dismissive hand. I'm simply inquiring about the nature of an unusual arrangement. After all, what use is a barren woman except for... That's enough. The deep voice from the doorway cut through the tense atmosphere like a blade. Samuel Donovan stood on the threshold, trail dust coating his clothes, his expression controlled but dangerous. Surprise flickered across Abigail's face. Samuel, I thought you were mending fences. Finished earlier than expected, he replied, his gaze never leaving Edward as he moved to stand beside Abigail and Martha. I thought I'd meet you in town. He inclined his head slightly. Mother. Martha nodded in greeting, satisfaction evident in her expression at her son's timely arrival. Edward assessed Samuel with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to measuring others by their appearance and status. What he saw, a rancher in work clothes with calloused hands and sun-weathered skin, clearly registered as inferior in his estimation. Ah, the purchaser himself, Edward said, his tone mocking. Come to defend your investment. Samuel's expression remained remarkably calm, though something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Mr. Montgomery, I presume. You know me? Edward seemed surprised. Abigail's mentioned her former husband, Samuel replied evenly. A man who values bloodlines above character tends to leave an impression. A flush crept up Edward's neck at the subtle rebuke. Well, you've certainly benefited from my preferences, though I wonder if you received fair value for your money. Samuel's hand came to rest lightly on Abigail's back, not possessive, but supportive. The gesture was small yet significant, a silent declaration of where he stood. Miss Harper is not property, he said quietly, the controlled tone belying the steel beneath. She is a valued member of our household, entitled to respect, particularly from a man who once vowed to honor her. Edward's expression hardened. Honor is earned, Mr. Donovan, and a wife who cannot fulfill her primary purpose demonstrates her true worth in ways you've failed to recognize, Samuel interrupted, his voice still measured, but carrying an authority that silenced the room. Her resilience in building a new life speaks volumes about her character, something that cannot be measured by traditional expectations. His gaze moved briefly to Edward's pregnant wife, who seemed to shrink beneath his assessment. There are many ways to measure a person's worth, Mr. Montgomery. The ability to provide an heir is perhaps the least of them. The storekeeper cleared his throat, clearly eager to diffuse the tension. Your supplies are ready, Mrs. Donovan. Shall I have the boy load them into your wagon? Martha nodded firmly, then wrote on her slate, time to go. Samuel offered his arm to his mother, who took it with dignity. Abigail gathered their remaining packages, her hands steady despite the emotional tumult within. As they moved toward the door, Edward called after them, his pride wounded by Samuel's composed response. I'd watch that one carefully, Donovan. She'll bring you nothing but disappointment. Samuel paused, turning back with a calm that seemed to infuriate Edward further. Strange. In the months since she's joined our household, disappointment is the one thing Miss Harper hasn't brought. His gaze swept over Edward's expensive suit, his carefully groomed appearance, the discomfort evident in his young wife's posture. Some men require heirs to validate their worth. Others find value in character, in loyalty, in creating a home rather than merely a lineage. Without waiting for a response, he guided Martha outside, Abigail following close behind. The storekeeper's assistant had already loaded their supplies into the wagon. Samuel helped Martha onto the seat with practiced care, then turned to assist Abigail. As his hands circled her waist, lifting her easily to the wagon bench, their eyes met briefly. In his gaze, Abigail saw not pity for the humiliation she had endured, but respect for the dignity with which she had faced it. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words encompassing far more than his physical assistance. Samuel nodded once, understanding in his expression. "Let's go home." The word home lingered in Abigail's mind as they traveled back to the ranch, Martha between them on the wagon bench. What had begun as a place of refuge, then become a position of employment, had somehow imperceptibly transformed into something more. Home. The concept felt both foreign and familiar, a half-remembered dream slowly taking tangible form. They had traveled perhaps halfway back to the ranch when Martha tapped Abigail's arm, pointing toward a small valley that branched off from the main trail. She wrote on her slate, "Stop there, something to show you." Samuel raised an eyebrow but guided the wagon down the smaller trail without question. The path wound through a stand of aspens, their leaves shimmering gold in the afternoon light, before opening onto a secluded meadow nestled between gentle hills. In the center of the meadow stood a small cabin, weathered but solid, smoke curling from its stone chimney. "Who lives here?" Abigail asked, surprised by the isolated dwelling. Martha glanced at her son, a wordless communication passing between them. Samuel sighed lightly, then explained, "No one currently. It was my father's hunting cabin originally." He guided the wagon closer, revealing a small garden patch beside the structure. "After my wife died, I stayed here for almost a year. Couldn't face the main house and all its emptiness." Martha wrote on her slate, showing it to Abigail. "Good place for healing." As they drew nearer, the door of the cabin opened and a figure emerged, a man in his 60s with a full white beard and the weathered complexion of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. He raised a hand in greeting, smiling at their approach. "Right on time, Martha," he called. "Got the tea brewing, just as you asked." Samuel shot his mother a questioning look. "You arranged this?" Martha's expression remained innocent, but a hint of satisfaction gleamed in her eyes as she wrote, "Time you two talked, really talked." Understanding dawned on Abigail. This was no chance encounter, but a deliberate orchestration on Martha's part. The older woman had created an opportunity for Samuel and Abigail to speak privately, away from the constraints and routines of the ranch. Samuel helped his mother down from the wagon, exchanging a few quiet words with the bearded man, who Abigail gathered was a longtime friend of the family. The two disappeared into the cabin, leaving Samuel and Abigail alone beside the wagon. "My mother," Samuel said after a moment, "is not as subtle as she believes herself to be." Despite the tension of the day, Abigail found herself smiling. Subtlety isn't always necessary when wisdom is involved. Samuel considered this, then nodded toward a fallen log at the edge of the clearing. "Shall we humor her then?" They settled on the log, a respectable distance between them, facing the meadow where late wildflowers still dotted the grass with purple and gold. For several minutes, neither spoke, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. "I apologize for what happened in town," Samuel finally said. "Montgomery's behavior was inexcusable." Abigail shook her head. "You have nothing to apologize for. Edward's cruelty is his own responsibility, not yours. Still, to face such public humiliation again, so soon after," he trailed off, his jaw tightening. "After being auctioned like livestock," Abigail supplied, her direct manner asserting itself. "The circumstances were different. Today I had defenders." She glanced toward him, "for which I'm grateful." Samuel studied her profile, admiration evident in his gaze. "You defended yourself admirably. Your composure was remarkable." A faint smile touched Abigail's lips. 5 years married to Edward taught me to maintain dignity in the face of subtle cruelties. Today's version was simply more public than most. They lapsed into silence again, watching as a hawk circled lazily above the meadow. "May I ask you something, Mr. Donovan?" Abigail ventured after a time. "Samuel," he corrected gently. "After all we've shared, formality seems unnecessary." The permission, small but significant, warmed her unexpectedly. "Samuel, then," she gathered her thoughts. "Why did you really purchase my contract that day? The truth, please." He considered the question, his expression thoughtful. "The simplest answer is that it was wrong. What was happening to you? I couldn't walk away from such an injustice." "Many others did," she pointed out. "Yes," he acknowledged, "to my continuing disappointment in humanity." He picked up a fallen aspen leaf, turning its golden surface in the sunlight. "But there was more to it. When your father announced your supposed barrenness, as if it diminished your value." His hand clenched, crushing the leaf. "It reminded me of Emily, of how her father regarded her as little more than a vessel for continuing his medical legacy." He released the crumpled leaf, watching it flutter to the ground. "And perhaps," he added more quietly, "I recognized something in your expression as you stood there. A particular kind of aloneness I've come to know well." The honesty of his answer touched Abigail deeply. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing me as a person when others saw only lack." Samuel turned to face her directly, his expression earnest. "Abigail, what Edward said about your worth being tied to childbearing, it's a cruelty I've seen inflicted on too many women. My medical training taught me that fertility is complex, affected by countless factors beyond an individual's control. Yet society places the entire burden on women, as if their value exists only in their wombs." His passion on the subject surprised her, though perhaps it shouldn't have, given his background. "You speak like a physician again," she observed. A shadow crossed his features. "Old habits. I apologize if I overstepped." "You didn't," she assured him. "It's refreshing to hear a man speak so sensibly on the matter." She hesitated, then added quietly, "Edward consulted specialists in Philadelphia, Denver, even Chicago. Each pronounced the fault mine, though none could identify a specific cause. 5 years of remedies, treatments, prayers, nothing worked." Samuel's expression softened with professional understanding. "Medicine still has much to learn about reproduction. Often doctors claim certainty where none exists." "Like Emily's father," Abigail noted. "Yes." The single word carried layers of old pain. "Frederick Montgomery is brilliant in many ways, but his certainty often borders on arrogance. He couldn't accept that his judgment might be flawed, even when the evidence suggested otherwise." Abigail stilled, her mind catching on the name. "Montgomery? Frederick Montgomery was your father-in-law?" Samuel looked at her quizzically. "Yes. Did I not mention his full name before?" "No, you didn't." Abigail's thoughts raced, connections forming rapidly. "Samuel, is there any chance that Edward Montgomery is related to your former father-in-law?" Understanding dawned in Samuel's expression. "You think they might be?" He frowned, considering. "Frederick had a younger brother, I believe. Lived in Philadelphia. I never met him, but Emily mentioned an uncle and cousins back east." "Edward's family is from Philadelphia," Abigail confirmed, her voice quickening with the implications. "His father is a banker, but he often spoke of his uncle, a prominent Boston physician." They stared at each other as the significance of this potential connection settled between them. If Edward was indeed Frederick Montgomery's nephew, it meant that Samuel and Abigail's lives had been intertwined long before that day at the auction block, linked by a family whose influence had altered both their paths. "It could be coincidence," Samuel said slowly. "Perhaps," Abigail conceded, "but coincidences of this magnitude are rare." Before they could pursue the thought further, the cabin door opened, and Martha appeared on the porch with her companion. She waved to indicate they should join her for tea, her expression suggesting she would brook no refusal. Samuel rose, offering his hand to help Abigail to her feet. As she placed her fingers in his palm, a current seemed to pass between them. Not merely physical attraction, though that was present too, but a deeper recognition of shared experience, of wounds that might begin to heal through understanding. "We should continue this conversation," Samuel said, his voice low. "There may be more connecting our pasts than we realized." Abigail nodded, aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. "Yes," she agreed, "I believe there is." As they walked together toward the cabin, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the meadow, while ahead the warm glow of lamplight spilled from the open door, a beacon of welcome, of possibilities yet to be explored. The revelation of a possible connection between Edward and Samuel's father-in-law lingered in Abigail's thoughts throughout the days that followed. As autumn deepened across the Wyoming landscape, painting the distant hills in amber and gold, a subtle transformation occurred within Donovan Ranch as well. The careful distance Samuel had maintained began to diminish, replaced by a tentative openness that manifested in small but meaningful ways. Lingering conversations after dinner, shared observations about books Abigail had discovered in the library, occasional rides together to check the southern pastures. Martha watched this gradual shift with knowing eyes, her satisfaction evident in the slight smile that sometimes curved her lips when she observed them together. She wrote less often on her slate now, finding other ways to communicate, gestures, expressions, and occasionally the painful effort of forming simple words with her damaged speech. One crisp October morning, Abigail was kneading bread dough in the kitchen when Samuel appeared in the doorway, a letter in his hand and an unreadable expression on his face. "This came with the supply wagon," he said, holding up the envelope. "From Boston Medical College." Abigail's hand stilled in the dough. "Have you opened it?" "Not yet." He turned the letter over, studying the official seal on the back. "It's addressed to Dr. Samuel Donovan, a name I haven't used in 5 years. Understanding the significance of the moment, Abigail wiped flour from her hands. "Would you like privacy to read it?" Samuel considered the question, then shook his head. "No, I'd appreciate your perspective, actually." The simple admission of wanting her input warmed Abigail more than she cared to admit. "Of course." Samuel broke the seal and unfolded the letter, his expression growing more perplexed as he read. "It's from Dean Harrison," he said, scanning the contents. "He says they have received an article submitted to the medical journal, an article describing my modified cesarean procedure." Abigail felt a flutter of apprehension. "But you never published your research." "No, I abandoned it after Emily." Samuel continued reading, his frown deepening. "He claims the article was submitted anonymously, but contains details only someone familiar with my work would know." He looked up, meeting Abigail's gaze directly. "The dean believes it may be my research, submitted by a colleague. He asks if I wish to claim authorship." A heavy silence fell between them as the implications settled in the sunlit kitchen. "Could someone have accessed your notes?" Abigail asked carefully. "Perhaps a former colleague?" Samuel shook his head. "I brought everything with me when I left Boston, all my research, diagrams, case notes. Nothing remained behind, except—" He paused, his expression darkening. "Except what Frederick might have seen during our preparations for Emily's procedure." "You think he might have submitted your work?" "It seems unlikely. Frederick spent considerable effort ensuring my research was discredited." Samuel folded the letter carefully, his movements precise. "Why would he now seek to publish it, even anonymously?" Before Abigail could respond, Martha appeared in the doorway, her expression alert despite the early hour. She looked between them, sensing the tension in the air. "Good morning, Mother," Samuel said, tucking the letter into his vest pocket. "You're up early." Martha moved into the kitchen with her characteristic determination, reaching for her slate board hanging from a hook near the stove. "What news?" she wrote, her gaze sharp with interest. Samuel hesitated, then extracted the letter again. "From Boston Medical College. Someone has submitted my surgical procedure for publication." Martha's eyes widened and she gripped her slate more tightly as she wrote, "Frederick?" "I don't know," Samuel admitted. "It seems out of character, given our history." Martha's expression grew thoughtful, her hand moving again across the slate. "You should claim it. Your work. Important," Samuel sighed, running a hand through his hair in a rare gesture of uncertainty. "It's been 5 years, Mother. I left that life behind." Martha's response was swift and decisive. Left practice, not knowledge. Procedure could save lives. The simple truth of her statement hung in the air. Samuel's gaze moved to Abigail, seeking her opinion without words. "Your mother is right," Abigail said gently. "If your procedure could help other women, other families, Don't they deserve that chance? The chance Emily never had? Samuel's expression tightened at the mention of his wife, but he didn't withdraw as he might have weeks earlier. Instead, he considered Abigail's words with evident care. I would need to review my research, he said finally. Ensure that whatever was submitted is accurate, complete. It's been years since I've examined those notes. I could help, Abigail offered, with organizing, transcribing, whatever you need. A moment of surprise crossed Samuel's features, followed by genuine appreciation. Thank you. It would make the task less solitary. The word choice wasn't lost on Abigail. For Samuel, returning to his research meant confronting memories he'd kept carefully walled away. Having company on that journey might make it bearable. Martha wrote again, satisfaction evident in her firm strokes. Good. Start today. Samuel gave his mother a wry look. You've become quite directive in your silence, Mother. Martha's eyes sparkled with humor as she responded, always was. Now just write it down. The study off the library became their workspace over the following days. Samuel retrieved boxes of notes, diagrams, and journals from a locked cabinet, the physical testament to years of research and innovation. Together, they spread the materials across a large oak table, creating a chronological record of the procedure's development. As Abigail helped organize the papers, she gained a deeper understanding of both the medical breakthrough Samuel had been pursuing and the man himself. His notes revealed a meticulous mind, certainly, but also a compassionate one. Every innovation aimed at preserving life, every calculation considering the human cost of surgical intervention. Your handwriting is remarkably legible for a doctor, she observed on their third afternoon, sorting a stack of anatomical drawings. Samuel glanced up from the journal he was reviewing, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. My father insisted, said if I was determined to become a physician, I should at least ensure my patients could read their own prescriptions. A wise man, Abigail replied, setting aside a particularly detailed illustration. This is remarkable work, Samuel. Even to my untrained eye, I can see how revolutionary it must have been. He moved to stand beside her, looking down at the drawing, a modified surgical instrument he had designed specifically for his procedure. The concept was straightforward, he explained, his finger tracing the diagram. Traditional cesarean sections required cutting through the upper uterine segment, resulting in significant blood loss and high maternal mortality. My approach utilized the lower segment, where blood vessels are fewer and smaller. Abigail studied the illustration with new understanding. And this instrument helped access that area more safely? Exactly. Combined with proper anesthesia and strict antiseptic conditions, the procedure offered a chance to save both mother and child in cases where conventional methods would sacrifice one for the other. The passion in his voice as he spoke was unmistakable, the physician re-emerging from beneath the rancher's exterior. Abigail found herself captivated not just by the subject, but by this glimpse of the man Samuel had been before tragedy reshaped his life. Why was there such resistance to your approach, she asked. If it offered better outcomes, surely the medical community would embrace it. Samuel's expression sobered. Medicine advances one funeral at a time, as the saying goes. Established surgeons, men like Frederick Montgomery, built their reputations on traditional techniques. Innovations that challenged their methods were seen as threats rather than advancements. He shook his head slightly. And I was young, ambitious, perhaps too confident, easier to dismiss than a more seasoned physician. Until results proved you right, Abigail suggested. I never got the chance to demonstrate those results, Samuel replied, a familiar shadow crossing his features. Emily was to be the first true test of the procedure. Abigail placed her hand gently on his arm. And now perhaps your work can continue through others, help those you never met. He covered her hand with his own, the gesture unconscious yet intimate. Perhaps. Their eyes met and held, something unspoken passing between them, understanding, connection, possibilities not yet articulated. Samuel's gaze dropped briefly to her lips before he stepped back, clearing his throat. We should continue, he said, his voice rougher than before. There's much still to review. Abigail nodded, returning to her task with outward calm despite the quickened beat of her heart. Whatever was developing between them remained undefined, but its presence was increasingly difficult to ignore. By the week's end, they had reconstructed the entirety of Samuel's research. The anonymous submission to the medical journal, they discovered, contained only a partial description of the procedure, accurate but incomplete, missing crucial elements of Samuel's approach. Someone familiar with the concept but not the details, Samuel concluded, comparing the letter's description with his original notes. Frederick might have observed enough to grasp the fundamentals but not the refined technique. Will you respond to Dean Harrison? Abigail asked. Claim the work? Samuel leaned back in his chair, fatigue evident in the lines of his face after days of intense focus. I believe I must, not just to claim authorship, but to ensure the procedure is documented correctly. He ran a hand across his jaw where stubble had accumulated during their scholarly seclusion. I'll need to write a comprehensive article detailing the complete method. That's wonderful, Abigail said sincerely. Your work deserves recognition, and more importantly, it deserves to be shared. A ghost of his former doubt flickered across Samuel's expression. Even if it failed when it mattered most? You never had the chance to attempt it, Abigail reminded him gently. Frederick's intervention prevented that. The procedure itself wasn't proven either way. Before Samuel could respond, the study door opened, revealing Martha. She entered with unusual urgency, her slate board clutched tightly in her hand. Visitors coming? She wrote, her expression tense. From Boston. Samuel rose quickly. Who? How do you know? Martha erased the slate and wrote again, her hand less steady than usual. Riley brought telegraph. Dr. Frederick Montgomery arriving tomorrow. With Edward. The name struck like physical blows. Frederick Montgomery, Samuel's former mentor, Emily's father, the man who had destroyed his medical career, and Edward, Abigail's former husband, possibly Frederick's nephew, a connection too significant to be coincidental. They know, Abigail whispered, the pieces aligning in her mind. Somehow they discovered I'm here with you. They know about the article submission. Samuel's expression hardened into resolve. This is no chance visit. Frederick has always been deliberate in his actions. He turned to his mother. When exactly do they arrive? Noon train. Riley says they telegraphed for hotel rooms. Samuel nodded, his mind clearly working through implications and possibilities. We have until tomorrow then. Time to prepare. He glanced at Abigail, concern evident in his gaze. Are you all right with this, facing Edward again so soon? The question touched her with its consideration. I've faced worse, she replied steadily. The question is whether you're prepared to confront Frederick after all this time. A complicated emotion passed across Samuel's features. Determination mingled with old pain. I've avoided this reckoning for 5 years, he said quietly. Perhaps it's time. Martha tapped her cane against the floor, drawing their attention back to her slate. What do they want? The research, most likely, Samuel answered, gesturing toward the organized notes on the table. Frederick must have realized someone submitted a partial version of my procedure. He's coming to either claim it entirely or ensure it remains unpublished. And Edward? Abigail asked, her voice carefully neutral. Samuel's expression darkened. That, I believe, has more to do with you than with medicine. The implication was clear. Edward Montgomery, a man defined by pride and possession, had discovered his discarded wife living with the man whose procedure might have saved his cousin's life. The coincidence was too perfect, the opportunity for manipulation too tempting to ignore. Martha wrote again, her message simple but powerful. We face them together. Samuel nodded, gratitude evident in the glance he exchanged with his mother. Together, he agreed, his gaze shifting to include Abigail. The word hung in the air between them, a declaration of unity against whatever tomorrow might bring. They arrived in Timber Ridge shortly before noon the following day, the small wagon carrying Samuel, Abigail, and Martha making its way down the main street toward the train station. The town bustled with its usual activity, shoppers at the general store, cowboys lounging outside the saloon, children darting between buildings on mysterious errands. Samuel helped his mother from the wagon, then offered his hand to Abigail. As her feet touched the ground, she straightened her shoulders, determination replacing the apprehension she had felt during the journey. Ready? Samuel asked quietly. Abigail nodded, appreciating that he had directed the question to her rather than assuming her response. Yes. The train from Cheyenne was approaching, its whistle piercing the autumn air as it rounded the bend into town. Black smoke billowed from its stack, drifting across the clear blue sky as the locomotive slowed, wheels screeching against the rails. They positioned themselves at the edge of the platform, Samuel steady and composed, Martha leaning on her cane with regal posture, Abigail between them with her head held high. To anyone observing, they presented a united front, a family rather than an employer and his household staff. The train came to a full stop, hissing steam obscuring the platform temporarily before dispersing on the breeze. Passengers began to disembark, a drummer with sample cases, a young couple with a small child, two cattle buyers in dusty suits. And then, stepping down with the precise movements of a man accustomed to commanding attention, Dr. Frederick Montgomery. Despite being in his 60s, Frederick maintained the upright bearing and confident demeanor of a much younger man. His silver hair and beard were immaculately groomed, his traveling clothes expensive but practical. The authority he projected was palpable, a man accustomed to deference and obedience. Behind him, Edward descended from the train car, his expression tightening as he spotted Abigail standing with the Donovans. His pregnant wife was notably absent, suggesting this journey was for business rather than pleasure. Frederick's gaze found Samuel immediately, recognition and something more complex flashing across his features. For a moment, neither man moved, the years of silence and accusations suspended between them like a physical barrier. It was Martha who broke the impasse, stepping forward with surprising vigor, her cane striking the wooden platform with deliberate force. Frederick's attention shifted to her, surprise evident in his expression. "Martha," he acknowledged, inclining his head slightly. "You're looking well considering the reports of your condition." Martha's eyes narrowed, but she merely nodded in response, her inability to speak preventing the sharp retort Abigail suspected she would have delivered. Frederick turned his attention to Samuel. "5 years is a long time, Samuel." His tone was measured, neutral. "You've been difficult to locate." "I wasn't hiding, Frederick," Samuel replied evenly, "merely living my life away from Boston." "Indeed." Frederick's gaze shifted to Abigail, assessment in his shrewd eyes, "and making interesting acquaintances, it seems." He glanced at Edward, who had moved to stand beside him. "My nephew tells me you've taken in his former wife, a curious coincidence." So it was confirmed. Edward was indeed Frederick's nephew, the connection between their lives more deliberate than random chance would allow. "Miss Harper manages our household," Samuel replied, his tone revealing nothing of the more complex relationship that had developed. "She's proven invaluable." Edward stepped forward, his handsome features arranged in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I can imagine. Abigail always was efficient, if lacking in more essential qualities." The deliberate cruelty of the comment was aimed as much at Samuel as at Abigail herself. Abigail refused to flinch. "How fortunate that efficiency is valued at Donovan Ranch then," she replied calmly, "just as other qualities are valued elsewhere." Edward's smile tightened at her composed response, but before he could reply, Samuel intervened. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private," he suggested, his tone making it clear this was not merely politeness, but a strategy to limit public spectacle. "Unless you gentlemen require rest after your journey?" Frederick waved away the concern. "We can proceed directly to business. I assume you have suitable accommodations for a discussion?" "The ranch will serve," Samuel confirmed. "We have a wagon prepared." The journey back to Donovan Ranch passed in strained silence, the 4 passengers in the wagon each absorbed in their own thoughts. Martha sat beside Abigail on one bench, the 2 men across from them, the physical arrangement emphasizing the divisions between them. As they approached the ranch, Abigail noted Frederick's assessing gaze taking in the property, the well-built house, the barn, the surrounding pastures. His expression revealed nothing of his thoughts, but she sensed he was cataloging details, forming judgments about Samuel's life since leaving Boston. Inside the house, Samuel led them to the study where he and Abigail had spent the past week reviewing his research. The organized papers and diagrams still covered the large table, evidence of their meticulous work. Frederick paused in the doorway, his gaze moving over the displayed materials with professional interest. "I see you've been reviewing your old work," he observed. "How timely." "Prompted by an interesting communication from Boston Medical College," Samuel replied, moving behind the desk, "regarding an anonymous submission about a procedure I developed." Frederick's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Confirmation rather than surprise. Yes, that's partly why I'm here. You submitted it, Samuel stated rather than asked. A colleague did, at my direction. Frederick removed his traveling coat, draping it over a chair with precise movements. After considerable reflection, I've come to believe your procedure has merit. It deserves further study, proper trials. The admission, delivered without apology or explanation for the 5-year delay, hung in the air between them. Samuel studied his former mentor with guarded expression. You condemned that same procedure when Emily needed it, he said finally, his voice controlled despite the emotion underlying the words. You called it experimental, dangerous, the work of an overconfident surgeon blinded by personal attachment. Frederick clasped his hands behind his back, his posture stiffening. I made a judgment in the moment, based on my assessment of the situation. That judgment proved incorrect. The closest thing to an admission of error they were likely to receive from a man of Frederick's stature. And now, 5 years later, you wish to resurrect the procedure? Samuel's skepticism was evident. Wait, Tom, because it could save lives, Frederick replied, meeting Samuel's gaze directly. And because medical science should not be hampered by personal grievances, no matter how justified they may seem. Martha, who had been silent throughout the exchange, tapped her cane sharply against the floor. All eyes turned to her as she wrote on her slate board, holding it up for Frederick to read. You destroyed his career. Now want his work? Frederick's expression tightened. I acted as I thought best at the time, Martha. The consequences were regrettable, but not my direct intent. Samuel gave a short, humorless laugh. You testified before the medical board that my judgment was compromised, that my experimental approach endangered patients. How else could that have ended, except with my license suspended? I was grieving, Frederick said, a rare note of emotion entering his voice. My daughter was dead. I needed someone to blame. The stark admission silenced the room. Edward, who had been watching the exchange with calculated interest, shifted uncomfortably at this display of vulnerability from his usually composed uncle. And now, Samuel asked, his voice quieter but no less intense. Frederick straightened, professionalism reasserting itself. Now, I recognize that medical advancement requires risk, innovation. Your procedure, properly documented and tested, could significantly reduce maternal mortality and complicated births. He gestured toward the research materials. I came to propose collaboration. Your procedure, published under both our names with trials conducted at Boston Medical College. The offer hung in the air, unexpected, complex in its implications. Samuel's expression revealed his internal conflict, professional vindication balanced against personal history. Abigail, who had remained silent during the medical discussion, found herself watching Edward rather than Frederick. Her former husband seemed less interested in the surgical procedure than in observing the dynamics between the others present. His calculating gaze moved between Samuel and Abigail, assessment in his eyes that made her uneasy. And what is your role in this medical reunion, Edward? She asked directly, drawing attention to his presence. Surgery hardly seems your area of expertise. Edward's smile didn't reach his eyes. Family support primarily. Uncle Frederick wanted a companion for the journey. He paused, his gaze sharpening. Though I admit curiosity about your situation here. When I heard you'd been sold to a Wyoming rancher, I could scarcely believe it. Miss Harper wasn't sold, Samuel corrected sharply. She was removed from an unconscionable situation. Edward raised an eyebrow. By exchanging money for her, as I understand it. The terminology seems semantic rather than substantial. Martha's cane struck the floor again, her expression thunderous as she wrote, different. Respect versus possession. Indeed, Abigail agreed, meeting Edward's gaze steadily. The distinction is quite clear to those of us who have experienced both. A flush of anger touched Edward's cheeks at the implied criticism. Before he could respond, Frederick intervened, clearly impatient with this diversion from his primary purpose. Perhaps we could return to the matter at hand, he suggested, with the authority of one accustomed to directing conversations. Samuel, I propose we put past differences aside for the advancement of medical science. Your procedure, properly documented and implemented, could be your legacy and Emily's. The mention of his late wife's name had a visible impact on Samuel. He stared at Frederick for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I'll need time to consider," he said finally. "This isn't a decision to be made hastily." Frederick nodded, seemingly satisfied with this response. "Of course, we'll be in town for 3 days. Sufficient time for reflection, I trust." An awkward silence fell, broken by Edward's deliberate change of subject. "I'm curious, Abigail. How does one transition from Philadelphia society to frontier housekeeping? The contrast must be striking." The patronizing tone was familiar to Abigail from their marriage. Edward's habit of highlighting her supposed shortcomings under the guise of polite conversation. "Less striking than one might imagine," she replied evenly. "The foundations are the same, managing resources, directing activities, ensuring harmony within a household. Only the scale differs. And the status," Edward added with false sympathy, "though I suppose when options are limited, one adapts to circumstances." Before Abigail could respond, Samuel spoke, his voice quiet but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "Miss Harper's position here is one of respect and value, Edward. Something I gather was lacking in her previous situation." Edward's expression hardened at the implied criticism. "You know very little about our marriage, Donovan." "I know enough," Samuel replied, his gaze steady. "I know a man who discards his wife for a single perceived deficiency reveals more about his own character than hers." A tense silence followed this direct challenge. Edward's jaw tightened, anger evident in the rigid set of his shoulders. Frederick glanced between the men, recognition dawning in his expression as he observed the protective stance Samuel had taken toward Abigail. "I see," Frederick said, his tone thoughtful. "This arrangement has become more than professional." Samuel didn't deny the observation. "Miss Harper's role in this household is not the subject of our discussion, Frederick, nor is it any concern of Edward's, given that he relinquished any claim to her welfare years ago." Martha nodded firmly in agreement, then wrote on her slate, "Enough talk. Offer refreshment before leaving." The abrupt transition to hospitality, so characteristic of Martha's practical nature, broke the tension slightly. Abigail seized the opportunity, rising from her chair. "I'll prepare tea," she said, grateful for a reason to step away from the charged atmosphere. "If you'll excuse me." In the kitchen, Abigail allowed herself a moment of unobserved reaction, her hands trembling slightly as she filled the kettle. The confrontation had been even more complex than anticipated, with Frederick's unexpected proposal and Edward's barely disguised hostility. She had just placed the kettle on the stove when a voice from the doorway startled her. "Still performing domestic duties, I see." Edward stood watching her, his expression unreadable in the kitchen's dim light. "How far we've fallen from the ballrooms of Philadelphia." Abigail turned to face him squarely. "Was there something you needed, Edward? Tea will be ready shortly." He moved into the kitchen, maintaining a careful distance but positioning himself between her and the door, a subtle power play she recognized from their marriage. "I'm curious," he said, his tone falsely conversational. "What exactly have you told Donovan about our marriage? What tales of woe and mistreatment?" "I've told him the truth," Abigail replied simply. "That we married, that you sought an heir, and that when I couldn't provide one, you returned me to my father like defective merchandise." Edward's expression hardened. "Such dramatic phrasing. I offered you a generous settlement, which my father gambled away within a year," she countered, "leaving me with nothing but the status of a discarded wife, too tarnished for another suitable match, too educated to be satisfied with menial employment." A flicker of something, perhaps guilt, more likely irritation at being confronted with consequences, crossed Edward's features. "And so you found yourself on an auction block in Wyoming. A rather extreme outcome." "Life takes unexpected turns," Abigail agreed, moving to retrieve cups from the cabinet. "Though I've discovered that what appears to be misfortune can sometimes lead to unexpected grace." Edward studied her with narrowed eyes. "You've developed feelings for him," he stated rather than asked. "For Donovan." The direct observation caught Abigail off guard, though she maintained her composed expression. "My feelings are my own, Edward. They ceased being your concern when you dissolved our marriage." He moved closer, his voice lowering. "You realize the impropriety of it, surely. Living here unchaperoned except for his invalid mother, developing attachments to your employer. It borders on scandal. How fascinating that you've suddenly developed concern for my reputation, Abigail replied, her tone cool despite the anger simmering beneath. After so thoroughly destroying it in Denver society. Edward's expression sharpened. I'm merely pointing out the obvious. Donovan is a man with a past, a physician stripped of his license, a widower who fled Boston under a cloud of suspicion. Hardly an improvement over your previous situation. That cloud of suspicion was manufactured by your uncle, Abigail countered, her defense of Samuel instinctive and fierce. And unlike you, Samuel values people for more than their ability to fulfill predetermined roles. A calculating look entered Edward's eyes. How touching. And yet, I wonder if your affection would remain so steadfast if other options presented themselves. The implication in his tone made Abigail pause, wariness replacing anger. What do you mean? Edward straightened his already impeccable cuffs, a gesture she recognized as his prelude to negotiation. Caroline's pregnancy has been difficult. The physicians have advised against future attempts. He paused, letting the information settle. It seems the Montgomery men are destined for complications in securing their lineage. I'm sorry to hear that, Abigail said cautiously. But I don't see how this concerns me. Don't you? Edward's smile was cold, calculated. My position in Philadelphia society requires an heir, Abigail. With Caroline unable to provide more children, I find myself reconsidering past decisions. The meaning behind his words became suddenly horrifyingly clear. You can't be suggesting a reconciliation, he confirmed smoothly. Your return to Philadelphia as my wife. Caroline would remain in the household, of course, as mother to my child, but your position would be officially reinstated, your reputation restored. Abigail stared at him, shock giving way to incredulous anger. You cast me aside because I couldn't bear children. Now you want me back for the same reason, because I won't challenge Caroline's position as the mother of your only heir. Edward shrugged, untroubled by the stark assessment. It's a practical arrangement. You would regain your social standing, financial security, the life you were raised for. Certainly preferable to ending your days as a frontier housekeeper. Or worse, he added, his voice hardening, as the companion of a disgraced physician whose career my uncle could destroy a second time with a single letter. The threat was unmistakable, linking Edward's proposal directly to Frederick's offer of collaboration with Samuel. Accept Edward's terms, or Frederick would ensure Samuel's procedure remained buried, his reputation permanently tarnished. Edward stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You should know that my uncle has maintained connections with the Wyoming territorial officials. One letter from him questioning Dr. Donovan's competence to practice any form of medicine, even on his own ranch hands, could result in serious legal complications. His smile turned cold. And as for you, my dear, unmarried women with questionable pasts don't fare well out here when left without protection. I've made inquiries. The territorial orphanage always needs staff, unpaid staff naturally, who work for their room and board, a fitting place for those deemed morally unfit for proper society. Abigail felt her throat tighten as the trap Edward had constructed became clear. He had anticipated her refusal and prepared accordingly. This wasn't merely an offer, it was an ultimatum designed to leave her no viable choice. I'll give you 2 days, he continued casually, adjusting his already immaculate cuffs. After that, the matter is out of my hands, and certain communications will be sent regardless of what my uncle decides about the medical collaboration. I do hope you're sensible, Abigail. You always were practical, until sentiment clouded your judgment. Before Abigail could respond to this blatant manipulation, a sound from the doorway drew their attention. Martha stood there, her expression thunderous as she took in the scene. Edward standing too close. Abigail backed against the counter. She struck her cane against the floor with enough force to make the dishes rattle, then wrote on her slate with fierce, angry strokes, "Get out. Private conversation." Edward's smile turned cold. Mrs. Donovan, always the protective matriarch. I was merely reminiscing with my former wife. Martha's eyes narrowed dangerously. She erased her slate and wrote again. Lies. Heard enough. Out. The command, despite coming from an elderly woman with limited physical capability, carried enough authority that Edward stepped back. "We'll continue this discussion later, Abigail," he said, his tone making it clear he considered the matter far from settled. "Consider my offer carefully." After he departed, Martha moved to Abigail's side, concern evident in her expression, as she wrote, "What did he want?" Abigail hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. "He made an offer for me to return to Philadelphia." Martha's expression darkened with understanding. She wrote again, her strokes firm and decisive. "Tell Samuel everything." "It would only complicate his decision about the procedure," Abigail objected. "Edward is using me as leverage against Samuel's collaboration with Frederick." Martha shook her head emphatically, determination in every line of her weathered face as she wrote, "Truth, always truth, no more secrets." The wisdom in this simple statement was undeniable. Secrets and unspoken truths had shaped all their lives. Samuel's hidden research, Frederick's guilt, Edward's manipulations, even Martha's own regrets about Emily's fate. Perhaps honesty, however painful, was the only path forward. "You're right," Abigail conceded, "but after our guests leave, Samuel needs to focus on Frederick's proposal without additional complications." Martha seemed ready to protest, but the kettle's whistle interrupted her. With a final, meaningful look, she nodded reluctantly, then gestured toward the sitting room where the men waited. The remainder of the visit passed in strained politeness, the tea service providing structure to an otherwise uncomfortable gathering. When the ranch faced a crisis after heavy spring floods damaged the north pasture, it was Abigail who reorganized the finances, finding enough reserves to repair the fencing without selling off valuable breeding stock. The ranch hands, initially skeptical of the city woman, nodded with new respect when her calculations proved sound. That evening, Samuel found her in the study, lamp burning low as she closed the ledger with quiet satisfaction. "You saved 10 head of cattle today," he said from the doorway. She looked up, a small smile playing at her lips. "I saved more than cattle. I saved our future." It was the first time she'd referred to the ranch as ours, and the word hung between them, significant and true. Frederick and Edward departed shortly after, returning to town with an agreement to meet again in 2 days for Samuel's decision regarding the medical collaboration. As the visitor's wagon disappeared down the road, Samuel turned to Abigail, concern evident in his expression. "Are you all right? Edward followed you to the kitchen." Abigail hesitated, Martha's advice about truth warring with her desire not to influence Samuel's professional decision with personal complications. "We can discuss it later," she said finally. "You have much to consider regarding Frederick's proposal." Samuel studied her face, clearly sensing there was more she wasn't saying. "Abigail, please," she interrupted gently, "one challenge at a time." After a moment of consideration, he nodded, respecting her request for temporary postponement. "Very well, but this conversation isn't finished." "No," she agreed quietly, "it's only beginning." That evening, after Martha had retired to her room, Abigail found Samuel in the library, standing before the window that overlooked the darkened valley. A single lamp burned on the desk, casting long shadows across the bookshelves and the man whose life had been shaped by their contents. "You should claim your procedure," Abigail said, stepping into the room, "regardless of Frederick's involvement." Samuel turned, unsurprised by her presence or her directness, even knowing his history of manipulation, his willingness to destroy careers when it suits his purpose. "Especially because of that," Abigail replied, moving to stand beside him at the window. "Your work deserves recognition on its own merits, Samuel. It shouldn't remain hidden because of one man's past actions, however devastating they were." He studied her in the lamplight, his expression thoughtful. "You've changed since you arrived here," he observed. "There's a certainty in you now that wasn't present before." "Perhaps I've simply remembered who I was before Edward convinced me my value lay only in what I could provide," she said quietly. "Or perhaps I've discovered who I might become, given the chance." Samuel's gaze softened. "You've always had value, Abigail. From the first moment I saw you on that auction block, standing with dignity despite everything, I recognized something rare, something worth preserving." The simple admission touched her deeply. "As did I, in you," she confessed. "A man willing to intervene when others looked away. A physician who remembered his oath even when he'd abandoned his practice." Something shifted in Samuel's expression, a decision reached perhaps, or a barrier finally lowered. "What did Edward say to you in the kitchen?" he asked, returning to his earlier concern. Martha seemed quite agitated when she returned. Abigail took a deep breath, knowing the moment for truth had arrived. "He offered to restore me as his wife in Philadelphia," she said directly. "Caroline's pregnancy has been difficult. Doctors advise against future attempts." Samuel's expression darkened. "So he would reclaim you now that it suits his purpose?" "As a secondary wife, essentially," Abigail clarified. "Caroline would remain as mother to his heir. I would provide the appearance of a complete household without threatening her position." "And he believes you would accept such an arrangement?" Samuel's tone conveyed his disbelief. "He believes I have no better options," Abigail replied. "A former wife, auctioned in public, living in an isolated ranch with a disgraced physician and his mother. In Edward's view, any return to respectable society would be an improvement." Samuel's jaw tightened. "And is that your view as well?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond the immediate circumstances. Abigail met his gaze steadily, allowing her true feelings to show without reservation. "My view," she said quietly, "is that I've found more value, purpose, and genuine connection in these months at Donovan Ranch than in 5 years as Edward Montgomery's wife. My view is that respect and understanding matter more than social position or financial security." A profound emotion crossed Samuel's features. Relief mingled with something deeper, more personal. "There's something else you should know," he said, his voice low. "Edward's offer wasn't merely self-serving. It was coercive." Abigail nodded, unsurprised that he had perceived the underlying threat. "He implied that my refusal might influence Frederick's collaboration with you, that your procedure might remain unpublished if I didn't accept his terms." Anger flashed in Samuel's eyes. "Using your future as leverage against medical advancement that could save countless lives. Entirely in character for both Montgomery men." "What will you do?" Abigail asked. "About Frederick's proposal?" Samuel turned back toward the window, his reflection in the glass overlaying the darkness beyond. "I've spent 5 years hiding from my past, from my training, from the physician I was meant to be." His voice grew stronger with conviction. "No more. I'll publish my procedure, with or without Frederick's assistance. The work deserves to exist in the world." The decision seemed to straighten his shoulders, as if a burden had lifted with the choice to reclaim his professional identity. He turned back to Abigail, his expression both resolved and questioning. "And you? What will you do about Edward's offer?" Abigail moved closer, drawn by the honesty of the moment. "Decline it, of course. In the months here, I've discovered something I never had in Philadelphia. Purpose, the ledgers balanced, the home renewed, Martha's friendship, the respect of the ranch hands who once doubted me. I've built something real, Samuel, something that's mine, not merely borrowed from a husband's position." "And after?" Samuel asked, his voice softening. "When Frederick and Edward have gone back to Boston, when the procedure is published, and this chapter closed, what then, Abigail?" The question touched the heart of what had been developing between them, unspoken but increasingly undeniable. Abigail considered her answer carefully, wanting to match his honesty with her own. "I've come to care for this place," she said finally, "for the life we've built here, for Martha." She paused, gathering her courage. "For you, Samuel, more than I expected, more than might be given our beginning." The admission hung in the air between them, vulnerable and true. Samuel's expression softened, hope replacing the guardedness that had characterized him for so long. "Beginnings don't determine endings," he said quietly. "If they did, I would still be defined by failure and loss." He reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and took her hand in his. "I've watched you transform this house into a home again. You've brought life back to spaces that had grown cold with neglect, including, perhaps, my own heart." The simple poetry of his words moved her deeply. "Samuel, I don't offer a perfect life," he continued, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "The ranch struggles, my reputation remains compromised, and I can promise neither wealth nor social standing." His gaze held hers, earnest and direct. "But I can promise honesty, respect, partnership in whatever comes next." Understanding dawned as Abigail recognized what he was offering. Not employment, not protection, but a future built on mutual choice rather than circumstance or obligation. Those promises mean more to me than any Edward could make, she replied softly. I would rather build something real with you than maintain appearances with him. Samuel's free hand rose to gently touch her cheek, his expression revealing the depth of emotion he had kept carefully controlled until now. Then stay, he said simply. Not because you were brought here or because you have nowhere else to go. Stay because you choose to, because we choose each other. In that moment, in the quiet library filled with books that represented Samuel's past and potentially his future, Abigail made her decision. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and placed her lips gently against his. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a declaration, but it deepened as Samuel responded, his arms encircling her with careful reverence. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, a smile touched Abigail's lips. I choose to stay, she whispered. Not for shelter or security, but for this, for us, for the life we might build together. Samuel's answering smile held a joy she had never seen in him before, unguarded, genuine, full of possibility. Then we face Frederick and Edward together, he said, with truth as our shield against whatever manipulations they attempt. Together, Abigail agreed, certain now of both her path and her companion upon it. Outside the library window, the Wyoming night spread vast and star-filled above the ranch. Inside, two people who had been brought together through circumstance discovered the rarest of gifts, a love born not of obligation or expectation, but of genuine seeing, authentic value, and the simple, profound worth of staying. 2 days later, Samuel and Abigail sat side by side in the hotel dining room in Timber Ridge, facing Frederick and Edward across a table set for luncheon. Martha had remained at the ranch, insisting the young couple needed no chaperone for a business discussion in public. The atmosphere was formally polite, but underlying currents of tension made the fine china and starched tablecloths seem like props in a theatrical production, setting a scene of civility that barely disguised the true drama beneath. I've considered your proposal carefully, Frederick, Samuel began after preliminary pleasantries had been exhausted. I appreciate the recognition of my work's value, belated though it may be. Frederick inclined his head slightly. Medical science must sometimes transcend personal history. Indeed, Samuel agreed, which is why I've decided to publish the procedure independently, under my name alone. A moment of silence followed this declaration. Frederick's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, while Edward glanced between his uncle and Samuel with calculated interest. That would be unwise, Frederick said finally, his tone measured. The medical community in Boston still remembers the circumstances of your departure. Without my endorsement, your work may face significant resistance. Perhaps, Samuel acknowledged, but it will stand or fall on its own merits, not on political alliances or personal vendettas. Frederick's composure slipped slightly. This is about Emily, then. You still blame me for her death. No, Samuel replied, his voice softening with an honesty that seemed to surprise Frederick. I've carried that burden alone for too long, unable to see past my grief to recognize that sometimes medicine simply fails, despite our best efforts. What I cannot accept is your attempt to control my work now, after destroying my reputation then. There's something I've wondered about, Abigail said carefully. Martha mentioned she warned Emily of danger before, that she felt partly responsible. Samuel's expression softened with old grief. My mother has carried that burden unnecessarily. She recognized signs in Emily's pregnancy that mirrored complications in our family history. Martha's own sister died in childbirth from similar symptoms. He moved to the window, his silhouette framed against the evening light. She tried to convince Emily to seek additional opinions, to consider postponing children until her health was more stable. But Emily was determined. She wanted to give Frederick the grandchild he so desperately desired. And she didn't tell you her concerns? Abigail asked. Not until it was too late, Samuel replied quietly. She feared coming between us, thought Emily might resent her interference. By the time she spoke to me directly about her fears, Emily was already in labor. His voice grew heavy with the weight of what might have been. If I had known earlier, perhaps I could have monitored the pregnancy differently. prepared better for the complications. That's why she's been so protective of you, Abigail realized, her way of atoning for what she perceives as her failure. Samuel nodded, and why she's been so fierce in her support of your place here. She sees in you someone who values truth above comfort, something she wishes she had prioritized when it mattered most. A flash of something, perhaps respect, perhaps irritation, crossed Frederick's features. You've become more direct in your years away from Boston. Frontier life leaves little room for polite fictions, Samuel replied. He reached over to take Abigail's hand, a public gesture that drew Edward's immediate attention, as does finding someone who values truth above comfort. Edward's expression darkened. So you've declined my uncle's generous offer. I wonder, Abigail, if your influence played a role in this decision? Abigail met his gaze steadily. Samuel makes his own professional choices, Edward, just as I make my personal ones. The implication was clear. Edward's jaw tightened as he registered both her refusal and the united front she presented with Samuel. You would choose this? He asked, genuine incredulity in his tone. A struggling ranch in Wyoming over restoration to Philadelphia society? Without hesitation, Abigail confirmed. Here I've discovered my capabilities extend far beyond what society deemed my only purpose. I've rebuilt financial ledgers, created a home from neglect, and found connection that values all of me, not merely my ability to continue a bloodline. Edward's expression hardened into the cold mask she remembered from their marriage, his defense against anything that challenged his carefully constructed worldview. You'll regret this decision, he said, the words carrying the weight of prophecy rather than threat. When the novelty fades, when you realize what you've sacrificed for this frontier romance. His hand moved slightly toward his inside pocket, a gesture just subtle enough for Abigail to notice but not obvious to others at the table. She recognized it immediately. It was where Edward kept his important correspondence in a leather portfolio, a habit from their marriage. The implication was clear. The letters he had threatened to send were prepared and ready. Edward's eyes met hers with cold calculation. My offer expires when we board that train, Abigail. There will not be another. Perhaps you should take a moment to reconsider, privately. Samuel's hand tightened protectively around Abigail's, feeling her momentary tension. Whatever threats you've made privately, Mr. Montgomery, I suggest you voice them openly now, he said, his tone carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded Boston operating rooms, or acknowledge that they hold no power here. Frederick glanced sharply at his nephew, pieces falling into place as he observed the thinly veiled exchange. Edward, he said warningly, whatever personal arrangements you've proposed are not part of our business here. On the contrary, Uncle, Edward replied smoothly, everything is connected, family matters especially so. A moment of dangerous tension stretched between them, the veneer of civility growing paper thin. Samuel's hand tightened around Abigail's, his support silent but unmistakable. Perhaps you should consider, Edward, that your measurement of worth differs significantly from ours, he said quietly. What you see as sacrifice, we recognize as freedom. Frederick, who had been observing this exchange with clinical detachment, cleared his throat. It seems both professional and personal matters have reached their conclusion, he observed, though not as I had anticipated. Life rarely follows our expectations, Samuel replied, a hint of hard-won wisdom in his tone. Sometimes, thankfully, it offers something better instead. The remainder of the meal passed in strained conversation about neutral topics, the autumn weather, the development of the territory, the anticipated completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. When they finally parted outside the hotel, Frederick paused before boarding the waiting stagecoach. Your procedure will face scrutiny without my support, he said, a final warning couched as professional concern. As it should, Samuel replied evenly. Good medicine withstands questioning. That's something you taught me, Frederick, even if you later forgot it yourself. Something unreadable passed across the older man's features, perhaps recognition of the truth in Samuel's words, perhaps merely resignation to an outcome he couldn't control. Without further comment, he climbed into the stagecoach, Edward following after a final cold glance at Abigail. As the coach pulled away, heading toward the train station and eventually east to Boston, Abigail felt a profound sense of closure. The connections to her past, to Samuel's past, were not severed but transformed, reduced to proper proportion rather than looming shadows. "Are you certain?" Samuel asked quietly as they watched the coach disappear down the street. "About everything, declining Edward, staying here, building a life in Wyoming rather than returning east?" Abigail turned to face him, the autumn sunlight gilding his features as she reached up to touch his cheek gently. "I've never been more certain of anything," she replied. "Some values can only be recognized when everything else is stripped away. Some homes can only be found after being truly lost." Samuel's smile held a warmth that had once seemed impossible, the expression of a man who had found his way back to life after years of existing in its shadow. He took her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture of reverence that held more meaning than any formal proposal. "Then let's go home," he said simply. "Martha will be waiting." Together they walked toward their wagon, toward the ranch that had become more than property or shelter, toward a future neither could have imagined on that spring day when an auctioneer's gavel had seemingly determined Abigail's worth. A year later, they were married in a simple ceremony beneath the wild lupines of Meadow Creek. Martha stood proudly beside them, her speech still limited, but her eyes speaking volumes as she watched her son place a handcrafted gold band on Abigail's finger. The townsfolk of Timber Ridge attended in surprising numbers. Even those who had once whispered behind raised hands now offered congratulations to the couple who had taught them something about dignity and true worth. By then, Samuel's procedure had been published in the Boston Medical Journal under his name alone. Letters began arriving from physicians across the country, some skeptical, others intrigued, but all acknowledging the potential his innovation held. The small study off the library became an active workspace once more, as Samuel corresponded with medical colleagues, offering guidance on implementing his technique. That spring, news arrived that a doctor in Chicago had successfully performed the procedure, saving both mother and child in a case deemed hopeless by conventional methods. "Your work has found its purpose," Abigail told him on the evening they received the letter, her hand resting gently on her own slightly rounded belly. The pregnancy had been unexpected, a joy neither had dared hope for but embraced with cautious wonder. Samuel monitored her condition with the careful attention of both physician and loving husband, while Martha prepared the nursery with quiet determination, her hands steady as she stitched tiny garments. They chose to convert part of the ranch house into a small clinic, where Samuel could treat patients from surrounding homesteads. Abigail assisted him, her organizational skills and compassionate manner making her an ideal partner in medicine as in life. Word spread of the doctor who had returned to his calling and the woman whose worth had proven immeasurable in ways no auctioneer could have calculated. In time, their family grew, first with the birth of their daughter, whom they named Hope in recognition of what they had found in each other, and later with the arrival of two orphan siblings from a neighboring ranch after a tragic fire. The home that had once echoed with emptiness now resonated with voices, laughter, and the sturdy, imperfect bonds of a family created through choice rather than obligation. Behind them, Timber Ridge continued its daily rhythms, the town that had witnessed both their humiliation and their redemption, now merely a backdrop to the life they had chosen. A life built not on what others valued, but on what they recognized as truly precious. The courage to begin again, the wisdom to recognize worth beyond convention, and above all, the transformative power of staying.